Good day. Today is Tuesday, 14th October 2025, and let me again start this video by asking you to tick the like button if, once having watched or listened to the video, you've liked what you've heard, or if you watch and listen to part of the video, if you still like what you've heard and have decided that you want to tick the like button. Well, with that, and thanks for doing that, by the way, let me now proceed with the substance of this program. And, well, if you follow the international news, most of the news is about President Trump being in the Middle East, talking about the end of the war, talking about Israel's complete victory, and emphasizing his own role in achieving that victory. Now, I have to say that all of these claims by President Trump seem to me to be very much premature. First of all, I'm far from certain that we have seen peace in Gaza, let alone peace in the Middle East. Israeli troops are still present in Gaza. There's no word yet that they're actually moving forward with their full withdrawal. There's still no agreement, so far as I can see, on the makeup of any peacekeeping force that is going to be deployed to Gaza. Hamas itself is speaking about its own disarmament and is casting some doubt, in fact a lot of doubt, about whether it intends for that ever to happen. And, well, so far from there being a clear-cut Israeli victory, well, we've seen the release of the hostages, which, as I said in many programs, is a good thing in itself. We have seen the release of Palestinian prisoners, which is also a good thing, though, as has been pointed out by many people, there are still many Palestinians still in detention in Israel for all kinds of different reasons, which I'm not going to discuss on this program. But anyway, everything about this agreement, this peace in Gaza, for the moment still looks very fragile. Hamas has been talking about a potential reconciliation between itself and the Palestinian Authority, which is based in the West Bank and which is led by the veteran Palestinian leader Mahmoud Abbas. But so far, that rapprochement has not taken place, and there's been any number of attempts by many people over many years to broker a reconciliation between the Palestinian factions. The Russians, by the way, had a hand in trying to do that, well, some time ago, not very long ago. And, well, one hears about how such a reconciliation is about to happen, and it never quite does. So there are still lots of things that could go wrong. And simply because President Trump says that there's peace in the Middle East, and simply because President Trump says there has been an Israeli victory, I'm not convinced, certainly about the first, and I would take issue with the second. The Israeli authorities, for example, have at many times spoken about one of the objectives of their military operation in Gaza being to destroy Hamas. And the very fact that Hamas is still negotiating shows that that objective has very far from being achieved. Anyway, I'm not going to discuss this further. I'm going to simply say that for the moment, everything remains in contention. I do want to see this process succeed. I want to make that very clear. I do want to see a peacekeeping force from the Muslim countries enter Gaza and establish itself there. And I do want to see economic reconstruction take place in Gaza. But we are not there yet. In fact, I would argue that we are very far from that point. And about a general peace in the Middle East, well, it seems to me that that remains far on the distant horizon, and whilst a settlement in Gaza, if it is achieved, would be a step in that direction, it would be one small step in what would remain an extremely long journey. I think, if I may say so, the president, not for the first time, is overselling his own achievements and is putting his own reputation significantly at risk if, or perhaps those who are more skeptical about this process, like myself, would say, when this whole thing begins to unravel. Something which I am afraid, I think remains very likely unless and until there is a serious negotiation between the Israelis and the Palestinians, of which for the moment I see no sign. A serious negotiation towards achieving a just and lasting peace. Anyway, that's what I wanted to say about this matter. Now, President Trump has also, of course, been talking about Ukraine. There's been some excited claims that he has suggested that Ukraine is his next priority after achieving peace in the Middle East, in Gaza. I'm not sure about that by any means, by the way. But anyway, he's talked about the Middle East, and he's talked about Ukraine and about the conflict in Ukraine, and he's been busy again floating the idea of sending Tomahawk missiles to Ukraine in case the Russians don't basically capitulate to his demand for a freeze of the conflict, which it seems to me, despite his own acceptance at the summit meeting in Anchorage, that a freeze or a ceasefire were not really the way to go forward. That is the default position to which he is reverting to. He's not explicitly said it, but again, he appears to want to end the conflict with what is essentially a freeze, one which does not address the root causes of the conflict that the Russians are bringing up. In fact, the underlying problem was for me exposed by certain comments which Trump intended to be jocular about a conversation which Steve Witkoff had with Vladimir Putin during one of Witkoff's visits to the Kremlin. Apparently, after about an hour, he tried to phone up to find out how the conversation was going. That's what he says. And he seems to have phoned Witkoff, or at least Witkoff's team, at regular intervals to find whether there'd been any progress from Witkoff. And it's clear that he became increasingly restless and impatient as the discussion between Witkoff and Putin stretched on for 5 years. For 5 hours, I'm sorry, not 5 years, 5 hours. And Trump seems to have found this all very strange and very funny. And over the course of his speech in the Middle East, he made fun of it. And I'm going to suggest that this is the fundamental problem, because as he has himself admitted, he doesn't seem to understand the complexities of this problem or how far the Russians live inside these complexities and how important they are for them. What it seems to me he assumes is a very straightforward conflict which could be settled with a single call. For the Russians, is a very important, existentially important conflict which requires painstaking negotiation and a careful work through all of the many problems. And we have had this happen many times. When Americans speak to the Russians, when they speak to Putin, Putin goes back discussing the whole history of this conflict, going all the way back in some cases to the formation of the Ukrainian nation and the creation of Ukraine, at the end of the Cold War, the various promises that were made to Russia and to the Soviet Union at that time, that NATO would not be expanded eastward. Putin talks about the political developments that have taken place in Ukraine since the Orange Revolution in 2004, and then the Maidan coup, as he refers to it, in 2014. He talks about the many broken promises that arose over the course of that long diplomacy. He talks about the Minsk agreement and how the various promises that were made to implement the Minsk agreement were never honored, how Angela Merkel deceived him by pretending that she supported the Minsk agreement, except as Putin believes she has herself admitted, the whole Minsk agreement was simply an exercise in playing for time so that Ukraine could rearm. And I get the sense that Putin explains this time and again, all of these things, time and again, to Western officials, and has tried to explain them several times to Donald Trump himself, but they are just not listening. They just think that it's just Putin going on and on again about the old matters that really don't matter anymore. In Trump's mind, the key thing is to stop the fighting so that he can then transfer all the forces that he wants from Europe to Asia or wherever to take on China. Trump also wants, no doubt, to claim the Nobel Prize and all of those things. And he doesn't understand, he won't understand, he refuses to understand that for Putin, and not just for Putin, all of these things really do matter. And unless the United States, unless Trump himself, unless Trump's officials are prepared to get into the weeds, get down to discussing and working through all of these issues with the Russians, this negotiation, this attempt that he's making to try to end the war is going to get nowhere. And Trump seems baffled that Putin, whom he assumes he has a good relationship with, I've never been completely sure why Trump believes that he has a personally strong relationship with Putin. But his assumption that that relationship, even if it is as good as he imagines, is by itself going to be enough to cause the Russians to retreat on these fundamental points, these key issues for them, the root causes of the conflict. If Trump thinks that, then he is profoundly and completely wrong. And it is baffling that 10 months on from the time when he won his election, 11 months since the time he won his election back in November last year, I believe it's 8 months on from the time that he became president. If he hasn't understood it by now, I frankly doubt that he ever will. And, of course, he again brings up the topic of the Tomahawk missiles, and he again talks to the Russians and he talks to the Ukrainians that unless the Russians agree to this ceasefire that he's demanding, which it is basically, as I said, what he's now demanding, that he's going to supply the Tomahawk missiles to Ukraine. And again, he appears to believe that this in and of itself is going to be the game changer. It's going to be what will make the Russians back down, because he imagines that these Tomahawk missiles and their ability to strike either at the Kremlin itself or at Russian oil refineries is going to force the Russians to capitulate to what he wants in some way and disregard and set to one side all of the massive accumulation of issues that they are so much concerned about. Now, all of this is provoking what is clearly now an intensifying debate in Moscow about whether or not it is worthwhile continuing the discussions with Donald Trump himself. Now, I've said in recent programs that Putin himself and people close to Putin still seem to want to maintain the dialogue with Trump. They still cling on to the idea that eventually Trump will come round and we'll start to see things their way. I believe that Putin came away from the summit meeting with Trump in Anchorage under the entirely mistaken impression that Trump is prepared to negotiate about the greater security architecture of Europe. I have said all along that I think that Putin is completely wrong about that, if that is indeed what Putin thinks. Putin's recent comments in Dushanbe, where he said he'd come to some kind of understandings with Trump, which had not been made public, to my mind, it refers to all of that. But as other Russian officials, as the Russian Foreign Ministry has been pointing out, there is no sign that Trump himself has any understanding or interest in renegotiating the general security architecture of Europe in the way that the Russians might want, and that there have been no steps at all from the American side to address Russian concerns on this issue or to move forward the dial with the negotiations in that kind of way. But Putin, as is his way, still wants to cling to the belief that something like that was agreed with Trump in Anchorage. That's probably why he agreed to meet with Trump in Anchorage at all. He probably got the impression from Witkoff that Trump was actually prepared to address these things. Baffling though I find that also, by the way. And anyway, he continues to cling to this idea that a dialogue with Trump continues to be possible. And, well, we've had a number of comments from his spokesman, Dmitry Peskov, which suggests that Putin himself still hasn't entirely given up on this idea that a discussion with Trump, a negotiation with Trump, is going to happen and is still possible. So we have Peskov making comments like this morning. We undoubtedly welcome intentions to find ways to settle the conflict and the confirmation of the political will to contribute to finding peaceful solutions. And the person that supposedly has these intentions is, of course, Donald Trump. Peskov was responding to questions about Trump's intentions put to him this morning by Russian reporters. And Peskov went on to say, we hope that, of course, the influence of the United States, the diplomatic skills of President Trump's envoys will help to encourage the Ukrainian side to be more active and more ready for the peace process. There's no sign of that, but that's what Peskov actually said. And Peskov, again, then spoke in glowing terms about Steve Witkoff. We are well acquainted with Mr. Witkoff, who is an effective professional. He has proven his capabilities in the Middle East. We hope that his talents will continue to contribute to the work of settling the Ukrainian conflict. So that's Peskov. But others take a radically different view. So, Dmitry Medvedev, who is, of course, the deputy chair of the Russian Security Council, and who was a former president and prime minister, and who has positioned himself as a hardliner on Ukraine issues. He would say that he's not a hardliner at all. He would say that he's a realist, and who has recently been on a trip to North Korea, to where there were celebrations on the 80th anniversary of the establishment of North Korea. There was a massive military parade which Medvedev attended as the guest of honor. And by the way, during that visit, Medvedev brought all kinds of presents from Russia for Kim Jong-un, including a letter, apparently, that Kim Jong-un's grandfather wrote in the 1940s to no less a person than Joseph Stalin. Anyway, just saying. Anyway, Medvedev has shot back. He said that he said in his usual characteristic way, which I'm not going to repeat, by the way, that he hopes that all the talk about Tomahawk missiles that's coming from Trump is all so much bluff and hot air, in the same way that Trump's various earlier claims about deploying nuclear submarines closer to Russia was also bluff and hot air and had no real meaning. And Medvedev said that he hoped that this was the case because, contrary to what Trump believes, if he does provide Tomahawk missiles to Ukraine, it will be bad for everybody, but first and foremost for Donald Trump himself. And Medvedev went out of his way to remind Trump that Tomahawk missiles are nuclear-capable weapons. They were originally designed to carry nuclear warheads. The Russians would not know whether the Tomahawk missiles were designed, that were being launched at Russia, were carrying nuclear warheads or not. And, well, anyway, Medvedev made all those comments, and the implication again was perfectly clear that supplying Tomahawk missiles to Ukraine was an escalation that the Russians would not accept, and that they might, in fact, that they would take countermeasures which would not be beneficial to Trump himself. Anyway, that was Medvedev. But in some respects, perhaps a more interesting comment has come from the Russian Foreign Ministry. And it has come from Rodion Miroshnik, who is a Russian ambassador at large. And he spoke to Russian television. Now remember, Miroshnik is an official of the Russian Foreign Ministry. He originally came from Lugansk, in the Lugansk People's Republic, but he now works in the Foreign Ministry. And of course, his ultimate boss there is Sergei Lavrov, and his superior is Sergei Ryabkov, who recently gave the report to the Duma saying that the Anchorage process had stalled, that the momentum had been lost and had become exhausted. So there's no reason to doubt that Miroshnik is speaking for what is now the consensus within the Russian Foreign Ministry, and that what he says echoes the views of people like Lavrov and Ryabkov. And he said this: if Trump is now trying to exert pressure, provide military assistance to the gangsters, and the gangsters in question are, of course, the Zelensky government in Kiev, and supply them with long-range weapons such as Tomahawks, then this raises the question of how authentic his peacekeeping efforts are, or whether he is starting to follow the same path as Biden, trying to support the Ukrainian side and escalate the conflict further. This is the political dispute that is currently unfolding. Notice that Miroshnik here talks about a political dispute. Political dispute where exactly? In Washington? Between the Americans and the Europeans? Within Trump's own administration? Or could it be that when Miroshnik says that this is the political dispute currently unfolding, he is referring to an argument within Moscow itself, within the political leadership in Russia, about whether there's any point in continuing to accept Trump's self-appointed good offices as a mediator in the conflict in Ukraine. To repeat again what Miroshnik says, if Trump is now trying to exert pressure, provide military assistance to the gangsters, and supply them with long-range weapons, such as Tomahawks, then this raises the question of how authentic his peacekeeping efforts are, or whether he's starting to follow the same path as Biden, trying to support the Ukrainian side and escalate the conflict further. You can almost see here the argument that is taking place in Moscow. People coming back to Putin, Lavrov for one, Medvedev for another. I have no doubt others too, and we'll come to them. And they're saying to Putin, well, you are treating Trump as if he can be a mediator in a conflict. This is already a strange thing, given that the United States has itself admitted that it is conducting a proxy war against us in Ukraine, and Trump is, after all, the President of the United States who is conducting that very same proxy war. And, well, he's now talking about providing nuclear-capable long-range missiles to Ukraine, and you're telling us that this man, Trump, can continue to be a mediator. Surely the very fact that he's talking about doing this thing is a sign that there is no further sense or point in talking with him about this whole issue of Ukraine at all. Now, here again, Miroshnik made it very clear that it's not the Tomahawk itself as a weapon that is for the Russians the concern. It is about the fact that Trump is trying to exert pressure on them, and is trying to do so by authorizing and assisting the Ukrainians to conduct long-range missile strikes deep inside Russia with nuclear-capable weapons. And over the course of this same interview on Solovyov Live, Miroshnik, about the Tomahawks, said this to say, the issue of the Tomahawks has been widely exaggerated. There is far more logic involved here, far more politics involved here than military logic. The Russian military is well acquainted with the Tomahawk system and knows how to counter it effectively. And Miroshnik then went on to say, and I'm taking all this from TASS, by the way, that pressuring Russia is futile, as it only weakens the US position as a country attempting to project a peacekeeping image. Such pressure merely pushes the conflict towards greater escalation. So anyway, this is what Miroshnik said. Now, other Russian agencies, and this time it's the intelligence agencies, have also been coming out over the last 24 hours, and they have also been making comments which basically call into question indirectly what Donald Trump is in effect doing when he says that he wants to find some means to end the Ukraine war. And we now have reports to TASS from Russian Federal Security Service officers who are telling TASS, this came out yesterday, it's a TASS report yesterday, that the FSB, the Federal Security Service of Russia, the FSB, has detected and thwarted an attempt by Ukraine's intelligence agencies, to organize the assassination of another high-ranking Russian Defense Ministry official. 4 suspects connected to the plot have been detained, including a native of a Central Asian country. And the TASS report then quotes these officials as saying, the FSB has prevented a sabotage and terrorist act against one of the senior officers of the Russian Defense Ministry, organized by Ukrainian special services in coordinations with leaders of the international terrorist organization IS. The attack was reportedly planned to be carried out by a publicly dangerous method, bomb presumably, in one of the Moscow's densely populated districts. Experts estimate that the power of the improvised explosive device assembled by the suspects would have created a continuous damage zone extending up to 70 meters. As a result of the operation, 3 Russian nationals accused of concealing traces of the planned crime and a Central Asian person identified as the direct perpetrator were detained in Moscow. According to the FSB, the plan developed by Ukrainian special agencies envisaged the perpetrator's death. During the attack, investigators say the alleged bomber was recruited by Saidakbar Gulumov, born in 1979, a member of IS wanted by both Russian and Uzbek law enforcement agencies. Instructions from Ukrainian handlers, Gulumov remotely directed the perpetrator's actions from Ukraine and several West European countries using multiple foreign messaging applications. And then we have all kinds of further details of the plot as outlined by the FSB that I'm not going to get into. Now, I don't know the truth of any of this. I am not privy to any of this information. This is information coming from the FSB. But look at what the FSB, the Russian intelligence agency, are saying. And it's come out at the very same time. Notice that we have all of the discussion of the Tomahawks taking place. We have an Uzbek national, he's clearly an Uzbek, organizing an attack in Moscow, targeting a senior official of the Russian Defense Ministry, using an improvised explosive device. And this Uzbek national has connections to IS, one of the major terrorist organizations that the United States claims to be combating. And this supposedly, and I want to stress, these are all allegations. I have no actual proof of any of this. We're told that 4 people have been arrested, but we have no information about that arrest or about the people themselves involved, other than the fact that one of them is a Central Asian national. Anyway, we have all of this happening, and it's supposedly or allegedly organized by the Ukrainian government, which is one and the same government to which Donald Trump proposes to send or is discussing sending Tomahawk cruise missiles. Now, it may be that this report from the FSB is pure chance, that it came out at this time as a product of this investigation that is taking place, that it is completely unconnected to the whole issue of the Tomahawk missiles and about whether it is acceptable to continue to go through the pretense of Donald Trump acting as a mediator. But, of course, there is also the other alternative view that this is further evidence of the pressure piling up in Moscow. People increasingly saying, what is the point of all of this? Why do we continue with this dialogue with Trump and his administration any further? He's talking about supplying Tomahawk cruise missiles to the Ukrainians, and he's continuing to have friendly conversations with Zelensky and his officials, even as the Ukrainians, Zelensky and his officials, continue to plan outrages of this kind in Moscow itself, targeting senior officials of our defense ministry. And on that point, by the way, it's worth saying that just a few days ago, Zelensky himself confirmed that he had given authority to the SBU, one of Ukraine's various intelligence agencies, to conduct further actions, unspecified actions. He didn't say what they were or where they would happen, but that they would take place outside Ukrainian territory. It might be that this was a reference to the shadow war that Ukrainian and Russian intelligence agencies are waging against each other in various places in the Middle East and Africa. It's known that the Russians and the Ukrainians are backing different sides in Mali and in Sudan, for example. But given the emphasis that Zelensky has placed on all of this, I can't help myself but think, especially in light of all that happened before, that Zelensky had in mind instead potential actions inside Russia itself. And, well, here we see the Russian counterintelligence and anti-terrorist agency, the FSB, coming back and making allegations that they've just thwarted an attack of exactly that kind. And all of this is going on even as this debate, argument, if you prefer, about interactions between the United States and Russia, about the value of those interactions between Russia and the Trump administration, continues to play out. And, well, I would add that even the Kremlin, even Peskov, acknowledge that the weight of the debate is going increasingly in favor of the hardliners. Now, he was asked to comment about certain comments made by Emmanuel Macron in Sharm el-Sheikh about how Russia's military stubbornness had supposedly prolonged the war and how Russia needed to pay a price so that it was compelled to return to the negotiating table. Well, Peskov responded to that comment by Macron by saying Russia is ready for a peaceful settlement. Russia continues the special military operation at the moment due to a lack of alternatives. One way or another, Russia will safeguard its interests and achieve its goals. So even Peskov, even Putin are saying, look, yes, we still want to negotiate, we still want to find a way forward through negotiations, but it's not our fault if negotiations are going nowhere at the moment. Address your questions about the lack of negotiations to the Ukrainians themselves, to Zelensky and Trump, with all his talk of Tomahawk missiles, is obviously being extremely unhelpful here. In light of that, and because the negotiations for the moment are going nowhere, we will continue the special military operation, and one way or another, Russia will safeguard its interests and achieve its goals. I wonder whether Donald Trump and the people around him are aware that this debate in Moscow is taking place, or have any real understanding of the way in which the ground in Moscow is shifting. Putin himself has gone very far in trying to work with Trump. He's met for many hours with Witkoff. He's had many meetings with Witkoff. He's had various telephone calls with Trump. He has met Trump in Anchorage. He wasn't keen initially of having a summit meeting with Trump. He said many times that summit meeting needed to be carefully prepared, but he went along and had that meeting with Trump despite the fact that there was minimal preparation, with all of the misunderstandings that inevitably followed from that. And, well, I've discussed how there have been multiple misunderstandings, both on Trump's side and Putin, coming out of that meeting in Anchorage, and how that has bedeviled all further discussions between the Americans and the Russians ever since. Playing poker with the Russians, which is what I think Trump perhaps still thinks he is doing, is a profoundly mistaken strategy. The Russians perhaps do understand that some of what Trump is doing is a bluff. Medvedev alludes to that fact, and Miroshnik says, well, let's not get too worried about the Tomahawks, because we know all about them, and they're not that effective anyway as conventional weapons. But the Russians now are treating this whole issue of Trump trying to bluff them, all the talk about the Tomahawks, all the piling up of pressure on the Russians, as a test of Trump's goodwill. Putin may cling on and say, well, let's give Trump a break. Let's give him a little more space. Let's see whether he will come round. But others within the Russian leadership, people who probably wondered why Putin agreed to hold a summit meeting with Trump in Anchorage at all, they're coming forward and saying, well, if Trump is playing these games of poker with us, what it really means is that he isn't really interested in our concerns, our legitimate security interests. He's not really taking steps to end the conflict in ways that are acceptable to us. At most, all he cares about is a freeze, which falls far short of our needs. And we can't go on with this fiction any longer that he is an acceptable interlocutor between us and the Ukrainians. He's never been a mediator because he's the president of a country that arms and supports Ukraine. He might be doing it through the back door now, getting his European friends to pay for it, but ultimately the United States continues to back Ukraine and continues to wage a proxy war against Russia in Ukraine. Perhaps back in January or March, we could have said to ourselves that he might be an interlocutor in the way that the Americans were interlocutors between the North Vietnamese and the South Vietnamese towards the end of the Vietnam War in the negotiations in Paris. But the reality is Trump is failing to be even that. So let's not waste any more time. Let's focus instead on the war. And as for Trump, well, he can continue to make his threats, but we shouldn't really waste any further time with him. As we have seen, his threats of economic war against us are empty. We have coped with the sanctions. Our key trading partners, China, India, and the others, are standing by us. The Chinese are themselves now in conflict with the United States on trade and economic issues, and that makes it even more certain that they will continue to stand by us. And as for the Tomahawks, well, they're a problem, but they're not such a problem that we should be too alarmed or nervous by them. And, well, it's worth perhaps bearing in mind that even Putin himself, faced by all of this, has had to come out and say now that if the Tomahawks are indeed supplied, then from that moment on, the entire process of dialogue between the United States and Russia, whether it concerns Ukraine or perhaps even other issues, and certainly the whole process of normalization between the United States and Russia, will come to a complete stop. If the plan, if the purpose of reaching out to Russia went beyond just winning a Nobel Peace Prize, but was intended somehow to stabilize the US position in Europe, to deliver peace, then the approach that the president is taking and his officials are taking is more likely to achieve the opposite. Now, as I said, I don't know whether Trump understands any of this, whether instead he continues to listen to people like Kellogg, who tell him wrongly that the Tomahawk missile is a game changer and that this will force the Russians to the negotiating table, if he continues to follow the advice of people in Europe who want him to continue with the war, whether that is the advice that he is listening to rather than the advice of others who might be urging him towards a compromise. Of course, I don't even know whether there are any others who are actually advising him to pursue a compromise. After all, I'm not even sure any longer what Witkoff's position is in the administration. There is word that he might drop out of the administration entirely at the end of the year. Just say. So, it may be that Trump is simply not getting advice about reaching out to the Russians, about how to reach out to the Russians, and that he's not hearing or getting any information about the discussions that are taking place in Moscow. But to repeat again, it seems to me absolutely clear now that to the extent that there is anyone left in Moscow who still believes that there is some point in reaching out to Donald Trump, that person is Putin, and it is Putin alone. Ultimately, and this is how things happen in Russia, Putin cannot pursue a policy of rapprochement with the United States if the entire political leadership in Moscow doesn't support him. In Russia, that simply doesn't happen. And it is simply not the way that Putin himself has acted in the time that he has been president. If the Russians conclude at some point over the next few weeks that there really isn't any further point in talking to Trump, because ultimately Trump himself, far from wanting to address their concerns, is talking about supplying Tomahawk cruise missiles to Ukraine, well, then the Russians will say to themselves, there's no point any longer in wasting time with this. Let's focus instead on the war. We are secure in our rear. Our Chinese friends and our Indian friends are with us for the duration. Over the course of 2025, countries around the world that might have been disposed to support an intelligently conducted mediation initiative to end the war by the United States, countries like Brazil, India, and of course China itself, have been antagonized and alienated in all sorts of ways. So the path towards us achieving victory now is open, and we should focus on that, and we should give up any idea that this president is ever going to negotiate with us seriously, be it over Ukraine or about the security architecture of Europe or about any other substantive matter. I think we are closer to that breaking point than we have been at any time over this entire Ukraine conflict up to now. During the period of the Biden administration, there were probably still people in Moscow who said to themselves, well, this is Biden and we know what he's like. We know what the neocons who surround him are like. Let's wait and see what the next president might do. Things might change then. Perhaps if that president is Trump, he will move forward and come to a negotiation and an agreement with us on the many issues that divide us. If the Russians conclude that they cannot achieve that kind of breakthrough with Trump, they will probably conclude that there is no prospect of achieving any kind of breakthrough or even diplomatic understanding with any US president at all. And then relations between Moscow and Washington really will fall into a deep freeze with no arms control, no arms treaties in existence to contain their rivalries, and with a massive new player, China, now also entering the game of geopolitical conflict with the United States, and that country also tangentially allied with Russia. So anyway, that's where we are. Now I'm going to say a little bit more about the Tomahawk missiles because I've had a cascade of information, and I've had information coming from one particular source, but I should say that this is information that though it is one source, it is more than one person, if I can put it like that. I don't want to say more because, anyway, there are all sorts of issues and problems that of revealing identities that I don't want to venture into. Anyway, the basic point is this. There are various different types of Tomahawk missiles. Tomahawk missiles that are designed for launch by US Navy submarines cannot be used and supplied to Ukraine. They are fundamentally incompatible with the needs of the Ukraine conflict. Nuclear-capable Tomahawk missiles also cannot be supplied to Ukraine. I've been told that the number of those is perhaps 1,000 out of a total stockpile of perhaps 4,000 to 5,000. So that already reduces the stockpile significantly. 1,000 nuclear-capable Tomahawks cannot be supplied to Ukraine. An undisclosed number of Tomahawks either operated by US Navy submarines or earmarked for US nuclear-powered submarines. Those types of Tomahawks cannot be supplied to Ukraine either. I don't know how many Tomahawks that leaves, but let's guess between 2 and 3,000. I think that's a good approximate figure. The United States, of course, needs Tomahawk missiles itself for all sorts of other different purposes. The US Navy, US surface warships carry Tomahawk missiles, and they are very much part of the US Navy's arsenal. And again, one must assume that the United States would not want to part with so much of its stockpile as to compromise the stockpile's viability in light of the possibility of a future conflict. And it has been pointed out to me that conventional Tomahawk missiles are only effective if used in significant numbers. I've been reminded again about the US attack on the Syrian Air Force base in, I think it was 2017, and the fact that, according to the United States, up to 57 Tomahawk missiles had to be launched against that Syrian air base. So that gives you a sense of how many Tomahawks need to be launched against a particular target in order to inflict appreciable damage on that target. And, well, there's been various claims about how many Tomahawks were in fact launched and whether the Russian, or rather the Syrian air defenses managed to shoot down any, and this is all hotly contested. But let's stick with the number of 57 that the Americans claim, and let's stick with the American claim that all of them got through. Within 7 hours, the Syrian air base was back in operation. So you would have to expend very large numbers of Tomahawk missiles out of a relatively small stockpile in order to make a significant difference. And, well, if we come back to the range of targets that are being talked about in Russia, they are immense. Even oil refineries, as I have discussed in many places, are far more resilient industrial facilities in terms of attack, even by cruise missiles, than perhaps people understand. We see that in Ukraine, where the Russians have been attacking the Ukrainian energy system year in, year out since 2022, and parts of it continue to function. In terms of Russia, we are talking about a vastly bigger energy complex. And the same is true about Russian air bases and industrial facilities. And of course, Russia has an enormously advanced air defense system. That magazine that I talked about recently, Black Mountain, which discussed the viability of supplying Tomahawk missiles to Ukraine, in a completely different article, not discussing Tomahawks, but discussing JASSM's missiles, said that in practice and in fact, the Russians would not use their very long-range air defense missiles, the S-300s and S-400s and S-500s that are now entering service to try and shoot down Tomahawk missiles. This is a misunderstanding of the way in which the Russian air defense system would function. Rather, the missiles, the air defense missiles that would be tasked with trying to shoot down Tomahawks would be shorter range point defense systems like the Pantsir, the Tor, the Buk M3, the S-350, which all exist in significant quantities and numbers right across Russia, and which operate with systems that would be better designed to shoot down missiles that operate at low altitudes. And apparently some of these systems, the S-350 in particular, are designed also to deal with stealthy missiles, like perhaps the JASSM, but of course the Tomahawk is not actually stealthy. And to that array of air defense missiles and systems like the Panzer, which is a combined gun and missile system, I would also, by the way, add the MiG-31, which was also designed way back in the 1970s to shoot down cruise missiles, specifically Tomahawk cruise missiles, with its R-33 and R-37 long-range air-to-air missiles, and with its enormous phased array radar, which is specifically, as I said, tasked with tracking and shooting down missiles like the Tomahawk against ground clutter. So the problem with using the Tomahawks would, to a great extent, be the difficulties of the limited size of the stockpile, the limited availability of missiles that could be used, and the strength of the air defense system of what is the world's biggest country, and the enormously dispersed nature of its energy and refinery systems and its various factories and headquarters, many of which would be very carefully hardened and protected against attack. It's been suggested to me that in order to achieve effective results, up to 100 missiles, 100 Tomahawk missiles would need to be launched in a single strike. And we can already see the problems. Now, having said that, these persons who have contacted me, or whose information perhaps more accurately I have been provided, and I'm very grateful to them, by the way, think that it would nonetheless be possible to develop ground launchers for the Tomahawks in Ukraine in some relatively short period of time. We have very different opinions about this. There are different commentaries about this from all kinds of people in the United States. I am not obviously expert in these matters. I'm going to go along with the presumption that the United States can put together some kind of ground launcher that could be supplied to Ukraine in a relatively short time, and that this perhaps could happen, maybe not by the end of this year, but sometime next year. Anyway, that perhaps can be done, but in order for this attack to be effective, hundreds of missiles would be used. And previously, by the way, one of these persons who has now contacted me pointed out that one of the issues about the Tomahawk missile is that though its warhead is big, it is not designed for penetration against hardened targets, and that is why you need large numbers of missiles to strike a single target in order to do damage. Anyway, that is one thing, or rather two things, that there are limits on the number of Tomahawks that can be supplied, and problems with the launch, but that the problems with the launch systems might not be as great as some people suppose. The other thing is, again, with the operation of the missiles themselves. And about this, there is an overwhelming consensus. If Tomahawk missiles are provided to Ukraine and are launched against targets in Ukraine, the entire process of identifying the targets, providing the target information to the missiles, launching the missiles themselves, operating the missiles at every level, the only way that can be done would be through direct American involvement. They would not be Ukrainian missiles being launched at targets in Russia. Trump apparently has been coming up with suggestions that the Tomahawks be sold to a European country which would then supply them to Ukraine. The reality is this would be even more of a fig leaf than it would be than is the case with other types of weapons. In reality, these missiles can only function if the Americans are involved at every single stage of their operation. And I've also been given some information about the level of expertise and training that some of the officials, some of the officers rather, who would have to be involved in launching these particular missiles would need to have. And we're talking about years of training and familiarity with every aspect of the system. So, in summary, this really doesn't seem to make any conceivable sense. You could perhaps launch 2 or 3 strikes with these Tomahawks. You would need to expend lots of missiles. You would nonetheless deplete your stockpile fairly significantly. Production perhaps can be brought up to a level of 500 of these missiles a year, but it is currently running well below that. And we know that the United States has had problems with scaling up production of missiles. The Economist recently pointed out, for example, that the United States no longer makes Abrams tanks, no longer builds from new Abrams tanks. It refurbishes old ones, and the time needed to refurbish one of these tanks is 2 years. So, anyway, I'm not going to go over all that again. So, limited numbers of missiles from perhaps vulnerable launchers, with the United States itself having to be deeply involved and enmeshed at every single level of operation. For missiles that are really designed to be used with nuclear warheads, but which presumably would be used with conventional warheads against the world's biggest country with the world's best air defenses. The political price is completely out of proportion to any conceivable military benefit. As Miroshnik correctly said, there is no military logic here. This is purely politics. It makes no military sense at all. And what it would do, far from achieving the objective, which is supposedly to bring the Russians to the negotiating table, is that it would destroy whatever residual goodwill exists in Moscow to continue the dialogue with the United States and to seek a negotiated end for the war. I recently read somewhere, I think it was Simplicius the Thinker, but I might be wrong about this, that there is actually a community of very hardline people in Moscow who actually would welcome the supply of Tomahawk missiles by the United States to Ukraine. They acknowledge that some of these missiles would get through and some damage would be done and some people would be killed. Some Russian people would be killed. But from them, this works to the objective that they have. They don't want a negotiated resolution of the war in Ukraine. They want Ukraine to be comprehensively defeated and perhaps even destroyed. Alexander Lukashenko, the president of Belarus, has said recently that there is a real possibility that if this war drags on and there isn't a negotiated resolution basically on Russian terms, then there is a very real possibility that Ukraine might be destroyed. Alexei Arestovich, Zelensky's previous spin doctor, has said much the same thing. And that is exactly what some of these people in Russia, maybe they're not there in the leadership itself, but then you never know. That's basically what these people want to see. For them, negotiations is something they would far prefer didn't happen. They would far rather see no negotiations at all, and for the Russians to just carry on with the war and to win. And if the price of killing off the negotiation track entirely is the supply by the United States of Tomahawk missiles of dubious effectiveness to Ukraine, well, that is absolutely a price that those people would pay. In fact, they wouldn't just pay it, they would welcome it. They would be delighted by it. Even, as I said, if the price was a prolongation of the war and some Russians being killed. There are hardliners in Russia who do think in that way. I've read their pieces, and they are becoming more vocal and more numerous and more self-confident. So, again, this is an incredibly bad idea. I don't know who exactly it was who came up with it. Maybe Kellogg, perhaps Trump himself. Of course, it could be Zelensky too. Another Russian commentary article has pointed out that short of US direct military intervention in Ukraine, which I still cannot imagine is ever going to happen, and short of supplying Ukraine nuclear weapons, which again I cannot imagine is ever going to happen, the Tomahawks are the last weapon in the arsenal that the United States has and which it can supply. And from that point of view, exposing their ineffectiveness is another plus. And of course, it also provides further information about the Tomahawks, which would be welcome by Russia's Chinese friends. So anyway, this is an incredibly bad idea. I don't know who came up with it. One wishes that it would be dropped, but Trump appears to be fixated with it and can't bring himself to let it go, even, as I said, as it works against everything which he at least says he wants to do. Even if, as many people believe, Trump has never really been interested in a genuine negotiated settlement of the conflict, even if his intention all along has been to lull the Russians into a disadvantageous ceasefire. And why he clings to the belief after Anchorage that that will ever be achieved, again, I would struggle to understand. But even if that is indeed Trump's objective, it is still a bad idea. It cannot achieve the objective. It simply sets up the United States and Donald Trump himself for future humiliation, which is, of course, exactly the point that Dmitry Medvedev, the Vice President of Russia's Security Council, has made. Anyway, let's, in light of that, talk about the military situation in Ukraine. And I'm going to do this briefly at the end of this program. Firstly, there's been more and more information coming from Pokrovsk. The Russian Defense Ministry yesterday said that the Russians have now broken into Mirnograd itself This is the big industrial suburb located to the east of Pokrovsk, that there is now fighting indeed going on in Mirnograd, and that Mirnograd is in the process of being stormed. This will probably be a complex battle because Mirnograd is a large area, large territory, and it is a relatively modern community with large numbers of the big Russian Soviet era high-rise buildings, which, as we have seen, are natural fortresses. But the Russians have now perfected the business of storming these high-rise buildings. They've had to do it in many places at many times, and they know exactly how it is done. And the other problem that the Ukrainian defenders in Mirnograd face is it looks as if the communications, the supplies, are no longer coming, that they are running out. And, well, I noticed that even neutral mapping projects now accept that the Russians control all of western and much of central Pokrovsk, and that the Russians almost certainly are in the process of capturing Rodinska to the north of Pokrovsk, and that they seem to have complete air control over the roadways, the supply roads that enter Pokrovsk from the west and from the center, and that the Ukrainian counterattacks northeast of Pokrovsk have been unsuccessful. There's been a, well, practically gleeful article in Radovka, the Russian newspaper based in Smolensk, discussing the failure of all of the Ukrainian counterattacks northeast of Pokrovsk, the way in which the Russians have defeated the Ukrainians, the fact that they've recaptured the village of Vladimirovka and are now apparently actually in the process of storming Shakhovo itself, the bigger village located close to Vladimirovka, east of the area of the big Russian breakthrough in August. It too apparently is now in the process of being stormed. Anyway, that's one area of the battle. I'm not saying that the Battle of Pokrovsk is within days of ending, but it's becoming increasingly clear that a large number of Ukrainian troops are trapped in Pokrovsk, effectively trapped in Pokrovsk. Some of them might still be able to escape if the order to do so were given now, but the losses would still be tremendously high. And as I discussed in a program that I made just a few days ago, it looks as if a catastrophe for the Ukrainian army is looming in this area. Now, General Syrskyi and the Ukrainian command have been up to their old game of pretending that they're on the counterattack, that they've launched an offensive in the area of the Russian breakthrough. Areas where they claim to have launched successful offensives before. They are now, to those who have been following their claims, claiming again to have recaptured villages which they have at various times already claimed to have recaptured at regular intervals over the last weeks. Mariana Bezuglaya, the dissident Ukrainian MP, has written a furious and actually rather sorrowful post about all of this, basically saying that all of these stories about counteroffensives in this area of northeast of Pokrovsk, that all of these claims were fake, that there was no reality, that there is no counterattacks or counteroffensives in this area. The whole thing has basically been a lie. I'm not going to read her comment. People can track it down. I have no doubt that in substance what she says is true. And the Russian Defense Ministry and other Russian reporting channels now confirm what Gerasimov was saying some time ago, that the Russians have indeed broken into Konstantinovka itself, the big town to the east of Pokrovsk, and fighting is already taking place inside Konstantinovka itself. And Ukrainian reporting channels are now saying that the Russians have indeed begun an operation to capture the village of Dronivka, west of Siversk, the fortified town in the northern Donbass, and Dronivka lies close to the last remaining supply road to Siversk, and apparently the Russians are in the process of storming it as well. And the Ukrainians themselves admit that half of Yampol, a bigger village to the west of Dronivka, is under Russian control. The Russians themselves claim that they control much more than that they control the greater part of Dronivka too. And there are some claims that the Russians are now in the process of tightening their grip on Liman itself, the big town, or, well, actually it's quite a small town, but the town west of Siversk, but still east of the key city of Slavyansk, and that there are claims that the attack on Liman itself is about to start. Well, all of this requires a lot more detailed discussion than I'm going to give in this program, but suffice to say that Bezeglaya has also spoken about a disaster in Kupiansk. She says that Kupiansk is effectively lost, that the Russians are basically clearing Kupiansk. There are agonized, angry reports from various Ukrainian channels saying that Kupiansk was never prepared properly for defense. By the way, I don't agree with that. I think this has been such a long battle that it's clear that the defense of Kupiansk was fiercely conducted and organized. It's just that the Russian forces in this area have been too strong. But of course, the battle ultimately is no longer just about Kupiansk. It is about the much larger Ukrainian force on the east bank of the Oskol River, Kupiansk itself being on the west bank, or mostly on the west bank. And it looks as if a large Ukrainian force there is trapped. So I spoke a couple of days ago about a decisive moment in the war. I said that a disaster appears to be brewing. I said in my program yesterday that people like Marat Hairulin and the blogger who writes at events in Ukraine appears to be confirming all of this. And those developments continue. There's been more Russian advances, by the way, in Zaporozhye and Dnipropetrovsk region, which I'm not going to discuss here. And there's been more Russian strikes, though not quite on the intensity that we have previously seen. So here it is. The Russians are winning the war, and the debate in Moscow is crystallizing, and it is crystallizing against seeking rapprochement with the United States. Does Donald Trump understand any of this? Whatever achievements he may think he has made in the Middle East in terms of peace, achievements which I personally think are quite likely to prove ephemeral, they will be completely overshadowed by the disaster that is coming in Ukraine. His latest moves, his various attempts to gain leverage, are making that disaster even more certain. And, well, China is pushing back hard. It shows no sign of relenting on the trade war, despite Trump's attempts to introduce a more emollient note in some of his more recent posts. I don't think he fully understands, or perhaps he doesn't understand, how bad things are becoming. Anyway, this is where I'm going to finish today's program. There'll be more from me soon. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar and by going to our shop. And last but not least, please remember again to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.